Hi, everybody. My name is Stuart Lieberman. It's such a pleasure to be with you here on Lawline and to discuss neighbors, flooding out neighbors. We have over 300 people signed up. There are a lot of people that are interested in flooding. So it's good to be with all of you. And that's stop, by the way. It's good to be with everybody to discuss this issue. Obviously, a lot of people are interested in this and for good reason. I'm an environmental lawyer. I've been an environmental lawyer since 1987, full time since 1988, and seen a lot of things that have changed, that have happened in my career. And one of the things that's changed is we're getting a lot more flooding cases. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that. But when I started, we didn't get that many. Today, it's just about every day that somebody calls and tells me that they have a flooding problem. And usually what they say is, my neighbors are flooding me out. So, and I need help and I need to know what my options are. And I'm sure that many of you who are watching today get the same phone call. So this is a really, really good program. What I'm going to do during the next hour that we are together is really just follow the slides. So stay with me, follow the slides, and the slides will sort of govern how the program goes. But before we get into the slide deck, I wanted to tell you why we're seeing more of these flooding cases, what's been going on, and at least from my perspective, what do I think is happening? Number one is the thing that people talk about. It's sort of the elephant in the room, and people have different views on it. But whatever your views are, it's clear that there's a climate change issue that's going on. I mean, I sure as heck am not going to get involved in the politics of climate change. That's not my intention, and I wouldn't do that to you. But whether it's you believe that there's a human component to this or you believe this is a natural cycle, doesn't really matter. What everybody agrees to is that there's a climate change that's going on, and part of that's causing tremendous flooding. So that's the elephant in the room. But there are a lot of other reasons why we're getting neighbor cases as well. Number one, there's inadequate infrastructure that's out there. Much of the infrastructure that's out there in terms of municipalities and counties and even at the state levels, it's old. A lot of the infrastructure. So when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about culverts and stormwater piping, etc. A lot of that was designed and installed 100 years ago, 50 to 100 years ago, when a 100-year storm meant something entirely different in terms of the amount of precipitation than it does today. By the way, I want you to know that. You have heard, I'm sure, terms like 100-year storm, 50-year storm, etc. That what that's supposed to depict is a storm that happens, at that duration. And if you've been around lately, the 100-year storm seems to be happening every other day. But you should know that the amount of rainfall during these events has changed. So what would constitute a rainfall or the amount of precipitation 50 years ago for a 100-year storm is a different number. It's much, much more. It's a much more significant activity in 2024 where we're doing this program than it would have been 50 years ago. So a lot of the infrastructure is outdated. We have climate change as one of the reasons. And then there's another issue that seems to be going on. Neighbors are flooding neighbors because there is too much water that the neighbor who's doing the flooding is seeing. Why? Because in many places there's been too much development. There has been overdevelopment and development that didn't properly plan for stormwater. What do I mean by that? In stormwater wasn't a sexy issue at all until basically the 1980s, where they started talking about it, and the 1990s when they really talked about it a whole lot more. And that's really where you see the development of our more contemporary stormwater regulations, starting, I would say, in the 1990s. Certainly in the 1960s, if you use the word stormwater, people would think of a storm and they would think of water. They would have no idea even what that meant. And so when projects were built and approved a long time ago, there was no consideration for stormwater. Where's the stormwater going to go? How are we going to control flooding? And also a lot of development occurred in the 1950s, 1960s after World War II, where a lot of the virgin soil that would have absorbed the rainwater, right, is no longer exists because it turned into development. So, and stormwater is rain from a storm. It's so when it rains, the water comes down. If you don't have development, it generally gets absorbed into the ground, and you don't have flooding. Not always. It depends on the quality of the soil, etc. If you have a lot of clay, you might still get flooding. But generally, that's how it works. When you develop, you get a lot of impervious surface. That impervious surface means ground that can no longer absorb water because there's building on it or because there's a parking lot on it. That's called impervious surface. That's a big word in stormwater. We talk about that all the time. Impervious surface is the ground that's no longer ground, but now some improvement, a roadway, a building. The more impervious surface you have, the less able the ground is to absorb the water, the greater the need to handle the water, and that's called stormwater management. That's the whole deal. A lot of development occurred back in the 60s, 70s. A lot of it was uncontrolled, and we have flooding that's occurred as a result of that. So those are sort of the big issues that I think are explained why we will see a lot more flooding complaints, flooding from neighbor complaints, etc., than we used to see before. And one thing I just want to point out before we get into the slide deck also is this. You have to watch it when your clients call and say they have when they say that they have a flooding problem because of a neighbor. One of the questions is your insurance going to cover it? And a lot of times it won't unless they have flood insurance. There might be some coverage, there might not be coverage. If they have flood insurance, there might be a greater likelihood of coverage, but you really have to look for it because a lot of times this thing really isn't, these issues really aren't covered by insurance, or they're inadequately covered by insurance. And so people really are looking for solutions. And as an attorney, it's your job to try to come up with something to help these people who are in a bad way. So that's the big picture about neighbors flooding out neighbors.